Thank you everyone for coming out tonight. I'm Nicholas Club, the president of the Historical Society, so thank you again. And this evening we welcome Richard Paulton. For over 30 years, he has been involved with real estate planning, urban history, and development. And he has served on the Hamilton Partnership for Paterson. And last year he published Paterson's Industrial Age, which I'm very excited to hear more about tonight. He's a Paterson native and now residing in Glen Ridge. So let's all give a warm welcome to you.
Thank you. It's very nice to see so many people here tonight. I guess if you give the people what they want, they can come out and see it, and what you want is Paterson. So I'm really happy about that. I'll just start a little bit about me. As Nicholas mentioned, I grew up in Paterson. My family was there, immigrated like so many. Everyone in Paterson has an immigration story. Two of my grandparents were born in Paterson. Two were immigrants, but everybody came from someplace in Paterson, and it goes back to the earliest times. I've been intrigued by the city ever since I was in high school, I guess, and went away to college and still found the place interesting and have continued my involvement ever since. Let me see if we can, I may be going in the wrong direction. There we go. The Paterson story, of course, starts with, it starts with the Lenape Indians, who were there forever. But during the Revolutionary War, Alexander Hamilton was an aide to General Washington, who spent a fair amount of time in New Jersey, as you know, Morristown and the Day Mansion, which it was all around here. And at one point during the Revolutionary War, they encamped at the banks of the Great Falls, and apparently it made an impression on Alexander Hamilton, who saw it and realized that at some point this might be a fantastic location for a new city. And as you know from the Hamilton story, whether you saw the play or not, Hamilton had this idea that in order to be a really significant national power and remain independent, the new country would have to embrace manufacturing as well as agriculture. That just being an agricultural society, an agrarian economy, wouldn't do it. And he was also concerned, as many people were, about the role of slavery. And his idea was that the country should be available, should be free labor, independent labor. And in order to do that, he had to develop a manufacturing economy. So he wrote a report to Congress and came up with a plan to form the first planned industrial city in the United States. They formed what we would call a public-private partnership called the Society for the Establishment of Useful Manufacturers. And they bought all of the area around the Great Falls, and they began a process of carving out a series of raceways so that there would be sites that would be available with water power. That's all there was at this time to begin the process of industrialization. And you can see that Paterson grew rather slowly at first. In 1840, there were about 7,500 people. By the 1870s, it had grown to 33,000. And you can also see that in the period between 1860 and say 1920, the city was really booming, gathering population, creating all kinds of industries and jobs. attracting immigrants from around the world, mostly from places where textiles were important, but not only textiles, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But many of the people that came to Paterson initially had a background in manufacturing. This is some of the early mill development that was taking place in Paterson. This mill that you see was known as the Colt Mill. Let me start by telling you, the backing up a little bit. The initial raceway system was designed by SUM hired a famous engineer, Pierre L'Enfant, who's maybe a little bit better known for designing Washington, D.C. He laid out the initial plan for the nation's capital, got to know the political leaders, including Washington and Hamilton. He got to Paterson, and he wasn't quite as efficient and successful as folks hoped, and he ended up getting fired. But he started an ambitious raceway project that later was taken over by SUM and redone. They hired a member of the Colt family, C-O-L-T, from Connecticut, who was far more effective and efficient and business oriented. And they began the whole process of building mills that were water powered. Initially, some of them, before the mills were done, there's one mill that's known as the Bull Mill, where they had a bull turning the turbines. And the initial businesses were largely textile related. Initial businesses were cotton. But the city attracted people from all who were familiar with the textile world, and Hamilton's idea was what we would call it intellectual property is something we want you to come with. Whether you had the rights to do it or not, he wasn't so interested in. So people came particularly from England and Ireland, who were familiar with textiles, brought their memories of how equipment was built, came into Paterson, and began doing their business there. And the skilled machinists that came, particularly from Europe, were especially important to the city. And I'll explain for obvious reasons. And that tradition lasted for a very long time, of people who were able to build things, invent all kinds of things, and were innovative in machinery as well as manufacturing. And in relatively short order, the city grew very quickly. This is a scene of mills along the waterfront, probably going. This image is about 1850, and one of the people who came into Paterson to build looms and other equipment got. Well, we had the introduction of the Morris Canal, which came into town in the 1830s. Then the railroad started to develop. We had a railroad line by the 1840s, and Paterson loom builder and mechanic and engineer got a hold of an English-made locomotive that came into his shop for assembly. And he looked at it and said, I can do this. Not only will I build the one that came in, but I'm going to start a locomotive business. And Paterson quickly became one of the most important locomotive manufacturing businesses in the nation. second largest after Philadelphia. Over 5,000 locomotives were built in Paterson. You don't think of it as a locomotive building city, but that was in fact the case. And here's the image of the Golden Spike at Promontory Point. I think it's Colorado. The locomotive on the right is a Rogers locomotive built in Paterson, and this shows that the Paterson locomotives built the Panama Canal. Were critical in building the Panama Canal. Were very important in the Civil War battles. Remember the Disney movie about the general and there were two locomotives that were battling each other, two trains that were crossing the country. One of them, of course, was a Paterson locomotive. The skills that were needed to build locomotives were significant. As I said, Paterson was an important manufacturing location. But the textiles persisted and continued. Oh, there's one other industry that grew up in Paterson that I'm sure you all heard of. One of the members of the Colt family was Samuel Colt, who was rented space in one of the family mills and invented the repeating revolver. Got the patent for the Colt 45. His timing in Paterson was not good because the military wasn't ready to adopt a revolver. He ultimately went out of business, moved back to Connecticut, reestablished the business in Hartford, and became one of the most successful gun manufacturers. It grew to an enormous degree. But if you come into Paterson and look at go to the Paterson Museum, they have some of the original Paterson Colt revolvers that were there. But it was, as I said, it was textiles that took over. Initially cotton, and then another member of the Colt family decided to convert a failed cotton mill. Cotton was a very competitive business, and the silk industry got its start and really took off. And within a matter of a decade or two, Paterson became the leading silk manufacturing city in the nation. And the story of the silk entrepreneurs were largely people who, Paterson was different in its textile industry than the places like Lowell and Lawrence, Massachusetts. Those were funded and owned by some of the Boston Brahmins, some of the wealthiest families in New England. Paterson was a homegrown industry. The people that owned the silk mills were largely men who came up from the factory floor, assembled, had the wherewithal, and also got into a product that was in enormously high demand, particularly in the post-Civil War era. As the nation became more prosperous, people wanted silk, women especially wanted silk, and a whole industry developed very quickly around silk. And this shows that in that period between 1840 and 1880, there were all kinds of silk operations, some very large ones, some smaller shops. Paterson also had the Passaic River, and we had lots of water, still do, sometimes more than we bargained for, as you read in the paper. But it was perfect for dyeing as well as for silk manufacture. And part of the reason that the Newark Reservoir system is in the northern part of Passaic County is because of the rampant pollution and degradation of the Passaic River that happened as a result of manufacturing, particularly in Paterson and Passaic at that time. the period that I focus on in my book and that I'm talking about today is really this period as the silk industry started to mature, and at its peak there were 25,000 people working in the silk industry and another 10,000 in the dyeing industry. So it was a hugely successful business. And the business leadership at that time really believed that Paterson would endure indefinitely. That in those days, if a city had an identity and had a product that they were really successful at, it was believed that they would continue to do that. Lyon in France was the model for the silk industry in Paterson, even though it was organized very differently. But they felt, Sheffield was manufacturing steelwork, and they said, we're going to endure, once we've got the basic ingredients to be a great manufacturing city indefinitely. And they built a series of buildings that reflect that optimism, that belief that the city would be around for generations upon generations, that the prosperity that they saw would only increase and grow. And unfortunately, the reality intervened. The story doesn't have quite as optimistic a happy ending as we would have liked, but the city has a lot of, I don't mean to disparage anything about it, but the city's history really took a turn. But I want to talk about that period, and show some buildings from that period when the city was enormously prosperous, the mills were being constructed, and life in Paterson was very robust. And I have some, and the images you're about to see are largely from the collection of the Paterson Museum. And I've been, as you heard, I've been active in the Friends group for the new national park in Paterson, and we're working on a visitor center. And the Paterson Museum had thousands of pictures, and I took a good chunk of them. As I looked at them to see what we hoped would be useful in the exhibits, I realized that they were all over the place. Hundreds of pictures. I realized if they were organized in a meaningful way, that it would tell the story of the city in a way that we don't know, we don't really know. So that's pretty much what I did. And the images that you're going to see are the ones from the Paterson Museum in that peak period of Paterson's growth and industrialization and other areas. So this is just a listing of all the cities in the world that were successful manufacturing cities, and the writer who was a promoter of Paterson, a business executive, said we're going to experience that same kind of longevity and prosperity, and projected that optimism. So here's the heart of the city. These are some of the major silk mills that developed. They were all large ventures, largely homegrown. The people who owned them were immigrants, but made their life in Paterson, had some connections to the city. A lot of these mills are still standing. We've lost a lot as a result of fires and urban renewal and economic obsolescence. And in fact, I've read planning reports from the 1920s which talked about the obsolescence of the mills back then. So, it's 100 years later. If they were obsolete in 1920, you can only imagine what they are today. And a lot of them have been repurposed. But they were specially built to service the silk industry. They remember in these days, initially the power that drove the mills was water sourced. And the idea was to be efficient. You couldn't go horizontally and capture the power that you needed to drive all the mills. the machinery. So they went vertically to three and 4 stories. There was no electric light when these were built. So the buildings are kind of narrow and the ceilings are high with big windows in order to light up the floor of the space. The conditions were very challenging. Not 6 day a week, 12-hour days, half a day off on Saturday. There was a lot of child labor. A lot of the women who worked there were the spouses of people who were working in the Rogers Locomotive Works or any one of the other locomotive works. I'll tell a quick story about some of the immigrants who came and started a lot of these mills. There is a town in England called Macclesfield, it's outside of Manchester. It's about an hour, no, not even a half hour, a train ride outside of Manchester. And Macclesfield was the silk center of England. They got into because of all kinds of trade issues that were taking place largely between England and France during the 1820s and 1830s. And the Macclesfield became non-competitive as a silk city. Someone from Macclesfield, the Ryle family initially, came to Paterson, said, "Oh, we have a silk." He started the silk industry in Paterson. Wrote back to his fellow unemployed silk workers in Macclesfield and said, "Paterson, what a great place! Come on over, and you'll get rich, and or you'll get a job if you don't get rich." It wasn't such an easy bargain, and it wasn't such an easy life. But 15,000 people from Macclesfield, many of whom had skills in the silk industry, came and settled. And of course, that's just one immigrant group. There were, in the early immigrant groups, came also from Germany and Ireland, of course, and Scotland. But Macclesfield was a key provider of skilled folks. And Bobby and I were in England last year, and we went to visit Macclesfield. And when we said we were from Paterson, we got a hero's welcome, which doesn't happen often. I tried it a lot. But what was really terrific was what they had an exhibit about about Paterson. And they had 5 big panels that were explained the relationship between the two cities. If you're ever and it's a charming town. It's been pretty much gentrified, and it's sort of like a New England, like if you go to North Adams, Massachusetts, which has a lot of the old mills, but around it is beautiful countryside and all kinds of cultural activities. It's great. So I've kept in touch with people we met there, and it was really it's really kind of cool. But Macclesfield was responsible for a lot of weavers and technical people who could fix looms. That was a highly skilled operation. And there are still some people I've run into who live in the greater Paterson area, or whose family was there, who traced their roots to that town. But as the industry developed, other immigrant communities that were largely textile communities ended up coming to Paterson. That's the source of the Mideastern population. There's a lot of people from Syria, Turkey, but the initial migration that's established that community was largely due to the relationship to the silk industry. People from I'm trying to remember which of the silk manufacturing cities in Syria were the initial people that came over. And the same is true with Italy. There were people from northern Italy who were in the textile industry. And the Jewish community in Paterson primarily has its connections to two towns in Eastern Europe, Białystok in Russia and Łódź in Poland. My grandmother's family came from Łódź. And those were also major textile cities. So people came to find an industry that they knew and establish their own communities, and that carried on for years. But these are 6 of the major silk mills that set up in Paterson. This building no longer is standing. This is the Lambert Mill, and those of you who've driven down Valley Road going into St. Joseph's Hospital have seen Lambert Castle. We'll be talking more about that a little bit later. Also, someone who came from northern England, established himself here in New Jersey, became very successful, built a castle that replicated his home, his image of what his home would have been had he been a well-born northern Englander. This is another textile-related industry that was very significant in Paterson was the Barber Linen Factory. The linen thread and this is an example, by the way, of a company that had ties back to Northern Ireland and Scotland. It became a partnership of a major manufacturer. They were the premier manufacturer of linen thread that was used in shoemaking and netting and leather goods, saddlery, all that stuff. All of those products required a very strong thread, and linen was the strongest by far, and they had a very successful operation in Paterson. Beginning in the 1860s, they had 3 locations, and these are some images of their factory. This is, if you go down Spruce Street, which is the major street near the falls, this is one of their buildings. If you go to the county administration building on Grand Street, for those of you who are familiar with Paterson, I want to hear your Paterson stories if we have time. They had a huge mill complex across the street from what's now right behind where Eva's Village is on Main Street. You're familiar with that. It's one of the big mills that was there. And the barbers were an important part of the city's culture and history. And in fact, they brought over so many Irish immigrants to work in their linen mills that the neighborhood around St. Joseph's Hospital became known as Dublin. It's Little Dublin. And it's still known to not as much. Today it's little something else. It could be Little Peru or something, but it was still referred to as the Dublin neighborhood. And the barbers operated a little differently than some of the other firms. They provided housing for the workers who came in. The other firms, it was you were on your own, and that may have been and that's the way it worked out. Whether it was good or bad, we'll leave it to others. And Paterson culture was where you worked also may define your social life. A lot of the baseball was very big in Paterson, right through. It's still popular in Paterson. It's not as quite because we have lots of people from the Dominican Republic, and to have a baseball team without a shortstop has some connection to the Dominican Republic. And of course, Larry Doby is a Paterson, not a Paterson native, but grew up in Paterson. He was an Eastside High School graduate, and his story is now being celebrated in a new museum and place that's being developed at Hinchcliffe Stadium, which you should all go to. But wait a while, because they're opening a terrific museum and visitor center within the next few months. But the stadium is really terrific. But anyway, this was the Barber Grand Street baseball team. There was another image that I saw. And as the mills became developed and that formed the basis of the city's prosperity, other things, the residential areas of the city began to grow. And I'm going to go through a few houses that, many of which, if they were around today, and unfortunately they're not, they would look right at home here in Glen Ridge. But Paterson developed a little earlier than Glen Ridge, but the Victorian influence was pretty prominent in Paterson. This is the home, an early Victorian home of Garrett Hobart, who was a leading Paterson attorney and politician. Garrett Hobart rose to become Vice President of the United States under William McKinley, and was active in the Republican Party. He was considered an exceedingly capable, bright attorney. He would have been President of the United States had he not died. He was a very big guy. And, the reputation is he just overdid it and died at a young age. His wife, he was an ambitious fellow who grew up in rural New Jersey. Married, he came to Paterson to study law with the leading attorney in town. His name was Socrates Tuttle. I just love that name. All of these people, again, if you're interested in, a lot of these people are buried in Cedar Lawn Cemetery, and it's a beautiful 19th century Victorian style cemetery which was a really big, that was, well, you see a little bit here right here in the Bluefield Cemetery on Glen Ridge Avenue. But this is at even a grander scale, a little more dramatic, with lots of mausoleums and, again, housing Paterson's most prosperous people. But he's in a temple. His final resting place is in a big marble mausoleum. But a very significant and important guy. Was the general counsel to the SUN, which still owned a lot of the land, and was able to develop it. And these people, the leading industrialists in a growing new city, suddenly became active in the utilities, developing the streetcar lines, developing water and electricity and all of the public services. There was a real city. You saw the rapid growth, but all of that created opportunities for real estate development. And if you owned a streetcar line, you could suddenly direct people to land that you may own or may want to own, or could then determine the prosperity in Haledon and Hawthorne and West Paterson, now Woodland Park, but all those places were opening up for new development. This was an incredibly growing, prosperous time, and these leading industrialists figured out that there would be opportunities for all, and all of these businesses. So, but Hobart was strictly political. Well, I shouldn't say that. As an attorney, he had a role in all of the things that were going on. Here's another early Victorian house. My notes are on the slides, but I think I'm doing just fine. This is on. I'm just trying to remember every name, and I'll do my best. This is the Crosby residence. This is an incredibly interesting architectural piece. It's got some arches and elaborate. Remember, we're now in the high Victorian era. This building was located on the corner of, this was located on the corner of Broadway and near Straight Street. The neighborhood has deteriorated pretty dramatically, unfortunately. But the lifespan of a lot of these places was fairly short because higher and better uses were coming into Broadway, so that they were economically not viable as single-family homes for very long, and became transformed. When Crosby moved out, this became the first. The neighborhood changed. It was a Jewish neighborhood at the time, and this was the first home of the Barnard Hospital. It was called the Barnard Dispensary, and they later moved up Broadway to 33rd Street and built a whole new building. That's a story in and of itself. But here's some of the others. This is the home of a silk manufacturer named Hamel, who had a Swiss background. Think of Paterson as a Swiss neighborhood. It doesn't seem cultural, but there were Swiss bakeries. There's Helvetia Hall, which was a gathering place for craft youth, became a labor center. Again, we have pictures of all kinds. This is in the English style. This is the home of William Ryle, who was a nephew of one of the founders of the silk industry in Paterson. A really classic English Gothic style residence, also on Broadway. Here's two others. The one on the top is the home of Henry Dougherty, who was a silk owner. If you go on Main Street, just his mill still stands. It's right across from the Water Commission. I don't know if this near Corrado's in that general area. Just further on the other side of the highway, you'll see the mill that Dougherty owned. The home down below was the home of another real estate executive. This is Reynolds was a banker who lived in town. Again, as I said, these were built probably around the same time that Glen Ridge was developing, maybe a little bit earlier. But you can see the prosperity that was evident here. This one is one of the grandest of the Paterson silk owner mansions. This is the Strange House. His name is William Strange, the silk executive, silk owner. He had a big mill on Beach Street. It was very successful, especially during the Civil War, making material for uniforms. This is the home of William Nelson, who was Paterson's leading historian. He had a title company, and in his spare time wrote lots of histories about Paterson. But the most famous of the Paterson residences was this one, the Lambert Castle, and it's been beautifully restored. It's reopened, I believe now. It took a long time to get it to its shape. These photos were taken when it was relatively new. It was built in the 1890s, and it only took like 2 or 3 years to build. So you can imagine the number of people who were working building this. This shows an arcade on the right where Lambert had his art collection. He established an enormously successful enormously significant art collection with a lot of the French Impressionists, and this is kind of the misfortunes of some of misfortunes, the lost opportunities in Paterson. The collection, Lambert, when there was a terrible, huge silk strike in 1913, when 25,000 silk workers went out on strike for 5 months. We talked about the rapid rise, but silk became a very competitive industry. The owners of the silk mills were always pressuring to increase efficiency, to get more out of the workforce, and the silk weavers, the entire silk industry, but mostly, everyone was going back to a craft orientation, and we had difficulties with automation and the demands, and everybody was under pressure, and it resulted in a hard-fought silk strike that no one won. Neither party could claim victory, but it really damaged the industry. Lambert had mortgaged his properties in order to get through the difficulties of the silk strike. And when several years after the silk strike ended, and his business hadn't recovered to the same level, he was forced to sell his art collection. So the collection, I think I have a picture of it. Well, this is what it looked like in its grandest time. Here's the interior of his art collection, all Cézannes and Renoirs and other significant paintings, all had to be sold at fire sale prices. So Paterson, and this was open to the public once a month or once a, and the likelihood is that if it had stayed, it would have stayed in Paterson. The other story I'll tell you, which is equally ironic and equally tragic, the locomotive manufacturer was a family named Rogers, and the family was very successful for a period of 70 years, from the 1830s to 1900. Then Paterson was inefficient. The technology changed. It was a congested city. They couldn't grow. The picture on the front of my book is of a locomotive being hauled to the tracks by a horse-drawn trolley, because the factory was down by the falls and the train lines were kind of far away. So it was a matter of time before it just couldn't compete with more efficient manufacturers. Well, Rogers was Rogers' son was a cranky guy, didn't really like Paterson all that much. Was just a difficult guy, very inhospitable, uncharitable, as opposed to some of the other people. Well, Paterson never had really great charitable people. They were hard-nosed. It was a bare-knuckle town. But when Rogers died, he had an estate of $5 million. He left all of his money to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. When you go to the Met next time, look at every one of the great European paintings that you love, the Bruegels, the Rembrandts, all of the classic paintings that form the backbone of their collection. And you'll see on the bottom, gift of the Rogers Fund, gift of the Rogers Fund paid for it. There's the art is estimated today to be worth $25 billion, because it's the most. Paterson got nothing. Can you imagine if Paterson had if he had endowed a technical school, or had done something that would have helped bring the next generations up. It wasn't the Paterson way to do it. So, but next time you go to the Met, take a look for the Rogers Fund, and you'll see the contribution of Paterson. At least it stayed in the region, but it would have been a whole lot better. Paterson would be a different city if some of these wealthy industrialists had put their money back into town. So here's some of the buildings that were built during the period when Paterson was at the peak of its economic power. This was the city hall. This was the initial city hall that was a cult mansion or cult house that they just raised up and built a floor below. It was on Colt Street actually. It became Church Street. But as Paterson grew and was approached its centennial, the city was founded in 1792. For 1892, they wanted to celebrate their coming of age, their maturing, they wanted to take their place in the world. They had a competition for an architectural design for the new city hall. And the competition was won by a firm called Carrere and Hastings, which is was one of the most established New York firms. The New York Public Library on 42nd Street is a Carrere and Hastings building, as are several of the buildings out in the Bedminster, Far Hills. Those big mansions are there. They did a number of very significant buildings. They won the competition and built a French-influenced design. And in fact, take a look at the tower that you see there, the tower that rises above the City Hall. This is the City Hall of Lyon in France. And what they did was just take the design of the tower, put it on a much smaller, less, more appropriate building. And that remains today. And when you go into Paterson next time, you take a look, you'll see it there. This is another building that was built right next door to it, and then with a big French mansard roof, Second Empire. Really rather dramatic. And then in 1902, there was a monumental fire that destroyed most of the downtown. Paterson was largely wood buildings, lots of overhead wires. There was a trolley barn at the foot of Broadway that caught on fire on a cold February night. The wind was blowing. It remains the largest fire in New Jersey history. Destroyed hundreds of buildings. Didn't affect the mills, but the entire downtown and portions of some nearby neighborhoods were destroyed. This is a map. Everything that was in red was destroyed by that fire. This is a building that was lost. This was the First National Bank building, and it was replaced. And Paterson rebuilt very, very quickly. Some cities, like Chicago, used the fire to think about what they wanted the city to be, redesigned it, grand plan. Paterson, we got to get back to work as soon as possible. They rebuilt as quickly as possible. This is also the Carrere and Hastings building. It still stands. And I'm just showing you the buildings that, as they look then, when they look their best. I'm not going to bring. I give walking tours every spring. If you decide to come, you'll see them as in their current state. But these are a number of the bank buildings that were built in the area and office buildings built around the City Hall. This is an all masonry structure. It was built before steel frames were popular. And the walls at the base of the building are 6 feet thick. They're not taking it down. This is a building that still exists. It's right next to the City Hall, and it's called the Colt Building. And if those of you who know, the architect is named McIntosh. Those of you who know the Rhinelander mansion on Madison Avenue, it's the home for Ralph Lauren, the Ralph Lauren store. Same architect, same kind of feeling. This is also a McIntosh building. This still exists. Uh, This building, the architectural world was crazy about the Pantheon in this period. It was being rebuilt after it was damaged in the Franco-Prussian War. And so it was on everybody's mind, and Paterson had to have a Pantheon too. This was the Hamilton Savings Bank, and the building was significant because we're going back now, the turn of the last century, the period 1890 to 1905. The story of the New York Stock Exchange is it was founded at a buttonwood tree in the Battery. The people came and gathered and started wheeling and dealing, and that became the origins of the stock exchange. Well, the front door of this bank, or the front area, was the buttonwood tree at Paterson. People would come, they would sell contracts, they would factor their inventory, they would buy future deliveries of all kinds of goods. People would come and look for work. If you were a weaver and you needed a job, you would just show up. And it's famous for having been that way. It was that way for 40 years. The Depression, the stock market crash, wiped out the bank and kind of ended that tradition, as far as I know. But for years it was the place to go to see Paterson history, Paterson dealings. I'm just going to show how Paterson architecture evolved. Here's the area on Broadway as it looked in the 1880s. Very primitive, or even earlier, very primitive buildings. The one building was that building at the end that was kind of fancy with a big French roof, mansard roof. It's called the Hour Building. It has the Hour glass, China glass, but it was really known as the Washington Building. That's what it looked like close up. I love this picture. I found it in the collection. This is a picture at that site of the Barnum Circus in town in the 1890s. A parade of elephants marching through downtown Paterson. They ended up, the circus was established at a racetrack in Clifton, but they would march through the downtown to promote the business and get everybody excited about coming to the circus. Hard to believe. Eventually, that building, the Washington Building, was demolished, but you can see how the transformation of the city in a relatively brief period of time was really dramatic. And this is a parade in front of that building. It was probably this is probably Garrett Hobart's funeral. Men walking with top hats down Broadway, and that's what that building evolved into in the 19-teens and 1920s. This is the site, a different site. This is the corner of Main and Market Street in Paterson. And initially, it was a hotel. The corner was a hotel, but look at the building on the left, which is classic English Victorian architecture. It looks like it could have been a train station or the facades. When you see British movies, it reminds you of that. Lafayette stayed in this hotel, believe it or not, and it's right and back. I'm just going to. This church is where the city hall later was developed. So this is going back to the 1880s, and this is the building that replaced it on Main and Market, and it's an all masonry building. You can see that the building next door to it remains. Now, this building, this was before the fire. This building was built before the fire, and because it was this big mass of brick and concrete, when the fire came up, butted up against it stopped the fire and saved the entire area along Main Street going down towards St. Joseph's Hospital. It was the fire stop but the fire, of course, kept going to the east. And this shows you why that fire might have had an easy time with it. Look at all these small wood frame buildings, overhead wires. It really was a disaster waiting to happen, and of course it did. And then very quickly, the next building to the left of it got built, and then the site was so valuable in the 19-teens. The building that was built right after the fire got demolished, and this high-rise building was built. And there's another lecture for another day about an architect who lived in Paterson named Fred Wesley Wentworth, who became Paterson's leading architect. And I have a whole story about it. I actually wrote a book about it. He was the architect who had a lot of the commissions after the fire, and also became the architect of many of the great movie theaters in New Jersey. Those of you who know the Stanley Theater, for example, in Jersey City, it's a big atmospheric theater. He did that. He became closely associated with a movie theater entrepreneur named Jacob Fabian, who owned most of the theaters in our area, including the Claridge and the theaters in Bloomfield and in Upper Montclair, but was one of the through the Stanley Warner. His firm became Stanley Warner, which many of you may remember as a name that operated things. But Wentworth was his architect, and Wentworth independently designed this. But this looks like has a big city look. Suddenly, it's it's not that ragtag village of wires. And Paterson also became the home of several major department stores. This was the origins of Meyer Brothers, which was built downtown, and this building was destroyed by the fire, and it was replaced by this building. And I know that some people in the audience remember shopping in Meyer Brothers, when it had 5 floors of merchant. It was one of those stores that had everything. You could get books and shoes and with the latest fashions. It was really quite the store. For those, I imagine that people in Glen Ridge were much more Newark oriented than Paterson oriented, but people from Clifton and Upper Montclair would regularly come to Paterson. Everybody would come to. It was the place to be, and the best shops. This is all before the malls opened up. And across the street, we had Macy's and Gimbel's in New York. We had Meyer Brothers and Quackenbush's in downtown Paterson. And this is the Quackenbush store. This still exists. The building still stands, and it's still a retail building. And it was in its day, it was quite fabulous. Has a wonderful stairway, winding spiral, ceremonial stairway that was built out of Guastavino tiles. It still exists. And then as Paterson evolved, these were some of the other stores that were there. There was a men's clothing store called Charles W. Elbow, which had the most elegant clothes of the entire region. And they moved into this building. There at the ground floor, for those of you who ever shopped in Paterson, it says Eclipse talking machines and Victrolas. And I, as a kid, they relocated to a store right across from City Hall, and that's where when you had to get the Beatles album as soon as it came out, you wanted to learn about jazz music. The guy who ran the store was terrific and made it very easy for it was a classic record store. So there's that picture of the. I could go on, but the era really ended of this that we're talking about today is the industrialization, with the Great Depression. That's when what makes Paterson so wonderful today is that it's a showcase of American architecture because of the fire, largely from the period of 1890, before the buildings that are standing before the fire, through around 1920, 1930. And there's those buildings, as you walk through the city, are seeable and doable. And I could show you dozens of other really interesting buildings and places that were developed during this period. The silk industry was non-competitive, moved out of Paterson. The skilled machinists that were in Paterson there was a tradition of that, and there was lots of apprenticeships and vocational schools. And Paterson also, I was reminded tonight, became one of the most important aircraft engine manufacturing centers, the Curtiss Wright plant. This gentleman remembers those days, worked there, and employed thousands of people during the war and after. The problem with Curtiss Wright, as I understand it, at least the Paterson operation, was that they made the best, finest propeller planes in the country. They made propeller-powered aircraft engines that were the most reliable. They probably won World War II with their capabilities. They made the engine that Lindbergh used to fly across the Atlantic. They made the engines that dropped the bomb on Japan. The Enola Gay. They were, and there were thousands of men and women who were skilled at complex machinery operations that made that plant so successful. The company, like, things changed. The synthetics came into the silk industry, and it wasn't quite the same. The aircraft engines evolved into jet engines, and some people didn't jump on that bandwagon and got left behind. And Paterson was an older city, and it was tough. As I said, most of the industries were on multi-floors. In the post-war era, everything wanted to be on one floor, and the congestion in Paterson was difficult. So, but Paterson persists and keeps going, and is going on. And for those of you who are still aren't convinced that Paterson is the center of the universe, I bring you this picture, which shows the transit network that made it possible for somebody in Wallington, let's say, to get into Paterson very easily, or come in, and these are the days when the rail lines were still active. You could take the Susquehanna rail line from Paterson into New York and get there in 40 minutes. There were trains that connected Wayne and Oakland, all kinds of places into Paterson. We had a great bus network, as you see. That when Route 80 got built, a lot of that was disrupted, and a lot of demolition took place in the city. We became an automobile dependent, and unlike Glen Ridge, which has the railroad and has made, that keeps the town. It's a major part of the town's success. Paterson has a railroad, but it's not. It's just another stop. It's not the destination. It's not the hub of the spoke. It's just another spoke. So what's next for Paterson? This is a project that I've been involved with lately. This is going to be the visitor center that's going to be developed across from the Great Falls. Where now Paterson has a national park. 300,000 people come every year to take a look at the Great Falls, walk around the park, and I hope that's something you all do. You'll see the potential of the city when you drive in and take a look. The falls are magnificent. It's remarkable that we have this great natural resource in the middle of this gritty industrial city. But just go down Valley Road and you'll get there. Pick a nice sunny day after a big rain, and you'll see some spectacular. You'll see a spectacular sight. And then on some Saturday, take a drive through downtown, and you'll see a lot of the buildings that you've seen tonight, and a lot more. And you'll see the potential of the cities. Other cities are doing it. We're going to get there. And there's some great restaurants and great places to go. There's a lot of vitality. It's a very, as I said, I grew up there. It's a very different place than it was when I was graduating Eastside High School. But I also appreciate the hopefulness that so many people have, starting businesses, operating restaurants and things like that, and building businesses. The population, unlike so many cities, the population has never shrunk. In spite of demolishing good portions of the city for the highways and urban renewal, the city's population is 160,000 now. It's as high as it's ever been. It's a gateway city. It's a city largely of immigrants from all over the world. But hey, we were all there at one point, or someone was in our families. So that's my talk. This is the final slide is the view that you'll see of the visitor center from the other side. And I appreciate the opportunity to meet you all, my neighbors, my new neighbors, and hopefully I'll see you all again. I do have some copies of the book for sale at $20. If you're interested, see me after the talk. I'll be glad to do it.
Thank you, Richard, once again. And thank you all for coming out. We have some refreshments if you would like to join us. Have a good evening.